North Africa, early 1943. The Desert Campaign is winding down, and the press wants to know about America's contribution, about General George S. Patton, the man commanding American armored forces now pushing through Tunisia. Montgomery's response is measured. He describes the Americans as eager, but inexperienced. They have a lot to learn, he says. But regarding Patton, the tone shifts. He implies a commander who is reckless, a Wild West general more concerned with theatrics than sound military practice. The reporters scribble notes. Some of Montgomery's staff shift uncomfortably. Because everyone in that tent knows something the journalists might miss, these words will travel. They will reach American ears. They will reach Patton's ears. And when they do, something will break that will never quite be repaired. But it wasn't just what Montgomery said to the press. It was what he wrote in his private communications. After the American disaster at Kasserine Pass, Montgomery sent a memo to General Alexander calling the Americans complete amateurs. The contempt wasn't just for public consumption. It was genuine, it was deep, and it would poison everything that came after. If you're here for the serious side of World War, the second history, the command decisions and personality clashes that shaped campaigns and cost lives, subscribe to this channel. We don't do hype. We do tension, ego, and the brutal reality of men under pressure. And here's a question I want you to answer right now in the comments. Whose side are you on? Montgomery's calculated caution or Patton's aggressive confidence? Vote now. Then, let's see if you change your mind by the end. This is not a video about who was the better general. Historians have argued that question for 80 years, and they'll argue it for 80 more. This is about something more human and more destructive. This is about what happens when two men of immense talent, immense pride, and entirely incompatible philosophies are forced to fight the same war on the same side. It's about words spoken in private that became public ammunition. About credit claimed and credit denied. About how leadership egos can poison an alliance even as that alliance wins battles. Montgomery and Patton were never going to be friends, but they didn't have to become what they became. Bitter rivals whose mutual contempt undermined cooperation, strained Anglo-American relations, and left scars that outlasted the war itself. This is the story of how that happened, how cutting remarks and wounded pride escalated into a war of egos that no armistice could ever resolve. To understand the collision, you have to understand the men. Bernard Montgomery entered World War II with a reputation already carved in stone. Methodical, thorough, a man who studied his enemy with the patience of a chess master, who refused to attack until every piece was positioned exactly where he wanted it. He had learned his lessons in the blood and chaos of the First World War, where reckless offensives sent thousands to their deaths for negligible gains. Never again, not under his command. Montgomery believed in certainty. He would mass his forces, concentrate his firepower, wait for the perfect moment, and then strike with overwhelming strength at a point of his choosing. Casualties would be minimized. Victory would be assured. It was a philosophy that saved lives. It was also a philosophy that moved slowly. But here's the thing about Montgomery that made him so dangerous to work with. He was not a humble man. He knew he was brilliant. He wanted everyone else to know it too. His public pronouncements radiated confidence that often crossed into arrogance. He had defeated Rommel at El Alamein, driven the Afrika Korps across North Africa, become a hero to the British public at a time when heroes were desperately needed. He wore that status like armor, and he made sure that everyone, friend and foe alike, understood that he, Montgomery, was the architect of Allied victory in the desert. Now consider George S. Patton. Where Montgomery was careful, Patton was audacious. Where Montgomery prepared, Patton attacked. Patton believed in speed, in shock, in hitting the enemy so hard and so fast that they couldn't recover. His philosophy was born from the American Civil War cavalry tactics he studied obsessively, from the tank battles of World War I he had pioneered, from a deep, almost spiritual conviction that war was about will, about forcing your tempo on the enemy until they broke. Patton studied history like a religion. He read Caesar, Napoleon, Frederick the Great. He believed, or at least claimed to believe, that he had fought in past lives, that he carried the soul of ancient warriors. Whether this was genuine mysticism or calculated self-mythology didn't matter. What mattered was that it fed his sense of destiny. He was meant for glory. War was his stage, and like Montgomery, Patton had an ego that filled every room he entered. But where Montgomery's arrogance was cold and intellectual, Patton's was hot and visceral. He wore ivory-handled pistols. He delivered profanity-laced speeches that became legend. He demanded absolute obedience and gave his men theatrical displays of fearlessness under fire. His soldiers either loved him or feared him, and often both at once. So here's what you had in early 1943, two brilliant commanders with entirely different theories of war, both convinced of their own genius, both craving recognition, now operating in the same theater under the same supreme command. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The trouble started, or at least became visible, in Tunisia. Montgomery's Eighth Army had chased Rommel across the desert from Egypt. Now they were closing in from the east. Meanwhile, American and British forces under Eisenhower's overall command were pushing from the west after the Operation Torch landings. The plan was to trap the Axis forces in a vice. Simple enough in concept, immensely complicated in execution. Patton arrived to take command of the the Second Corps after the disaster at Kasserine Pass, where German forces had mauled green American troops and exposed serious deficiencies in American combat readiness. Patton's job was to restore pride, discipline, and fighting effectiveness. And he did, with brutal efficiency. Soldiers who weren't wearing proper uniforms got fined. Officers who showed weakness got relieved. The entire Corps got a shock to its system, and it worked. American units started fighting with competence and aggression. But here's where the personalities started to grind. Montgomery, in his communications with overall Allied command, made it clear that he considered the Americans unreliable, not ready for serious combat, complete amateurs, as he told General Alexander. Useful for secondary objectives, perhaps, but the real work, the decisive blows, those would have to come from British forces under his command. He phrased it diplomatically in official reports, but the sentiment leaked through, and Patton heard it. Patton's response was volcanic rage contained just barely beneath a professional surface. He saw Montgomery as a glory hound, as someone who moved so slowly that opportunities evaporated, and who then took credit for victories that might have been won more decisively with bolder action. Montgomery's caution wasn't wisdom to Patton. It was timidity dressed up as prudence. And then came Montgomery's attitude toward the American contribution, the remarks about American inexperience, the faint praise that somehow felt like condescension, the implication that British forces were carrying the real burden of the war while the Americans learned how to fight. For Patton, this was intolerable, not just professionally, but personally, because Patton needed glory the way other men needed air. He needed his name in the newspapers, needed his accomplishments recognized, needed to prove that he was not just competent but exceptional. And here was Montgomery stealing that recognition, diminishing American achievements, positioning himself as the indispensable man. In Patton's diary, the entries became increasingly bitter. He referred to Montgomery as cautious to the point of cowardice, as a man more interested in avoiding failure than achieving greatness. The contempt was mutual, but expressed differently. Montgomery's disdain came wrapped in polite British understatement. Patton's came raw and profane. The Allied command structure tried to manage it. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, understood that he needed both men. He needed Montgomery's methodical competence and public credibility with the British. He needed Patton's aggressive energy and ability to inspire American troops. But managing their egos was like juggling nitroglycerin. One wrong move, and the whole thing could explode. Tunisia ended with Axis surrender in May 1943. A clear Allied victory. But even in victory, the seeds of deeper conflict had been planted, because the next campaign was already being planned: Sicily. And in Sicily, the war between Montgomery and Patton would move from whispered complaints to open confrontation. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, was supposed to demonstrate Allied unity and coordination. Instead, it became a proving ground for ego. The plan gave Montgomery the main effort on the eastern side of the island, driving north toward Messina, the key port and the escape route for German and Italian forces. Patton's 7th Army would take the supporting role, protecting Montgomery's flank and mopping up western Sicily. It was, from Patton's perspective, a humiliating assignment, a secondary mission designed to keep the Americans busy while the British won the glory. And here's the crucial piece. General Alexander, the supreme Allied commander in the theater, had given Montgomery the priority. Alexander saw the British 8th Army as the experienced, reliable force. The Americans were useful, but subordinate. This was Alexander's decision, but it reflected Montgomery's influence and Montgomery's dismissive attitude toward American capabilities. Montgomery made it clear that he considered his route the only one that mattered. His forces would deliver the knockout blow. The Americans would play their part, but it was a supporting part. He communicated this not with malice, necessarily, but with the kind of casual certainty that somehow made it worse. Patton landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943, with something to prove. And what happened next was vintage Patton. He fought his own commanders to get permission to change the plan. Patton had to twist Alexander's arm, had to argue and cajole and essentially beg to be allowed to take Palermo and drive across western Sicily. It wasn't just defiance. It was Patton fighting against the secondary role that had been assigned to him, fighting to prove that American forces deserved equal status with the British. And when permission finally came, grudging and limited, Patton turned his supporting mission into a race. While Montgomery's forces ground forward against stiff German resistance on the eastern coastal road, Patton sent his armor slashing across the interior of the island. He took Palermo, a major city, in a lightning campaign that made headlines and accomplished relatively little strategic value. Then he turned east and drove his forces along the northern coast toward Messina in a direct challenge to Montgomery's advance. This was not coordination. This was competition, and Patton made sure the press knew about it. American newspapers ran stories about Patton's dash across Sicily, about American troops liberating towns and pushing forward while British forces moved cautiously against prepared defenses. The narrative that Patton wanted was taking shape. Americans were aggressive winners, British were slow plotters. Montgomery's response was icy fury. He saw Patton's maneuver for exactly what it was, a publicity stunt. Taking Palermo didn't trap German forces. It didn't prevent their escape. It was a race for headlines, not a contribution to victory. And worse, it was working. The American press was eating it up. In his communications with British command, Montgomery expressed his frustrations carefully. But the subtext was clear. The Americans cared more about glory than genuine military achievement. They were playing to the cameras while British soldiers did the hard fighting against the real German resistance. Patton reached Messina hours before Montgomery's lead elements. Hours. It should have been a footnote, but for Patton, it was vindication. He had beaten Montgomery to the objective. American troops had won the race. And he made absolutely certain that the press covered it extensively. For Montgomery, it was proof of everything he suspected about Patton. The man was a showboat, reckless, more interested in personal triumph than the disciplined execution of sound strategy. The fact that German forces escaped across the Strait of Messina, that the campaign failed to trap and destroy them, that should have been the story. Instead, it was Patton's victory lap. The professional relationship between the two men, already strained, had now shattered into something like open hostility. They were civil in official communications. They maintained the appearance of Allied cooperation, but privately, each had concluded that the other was fundamentally unfit for high command. And they were both telling anyone who would listen. In August 1943, at the height of his Sicilian triumph, George Patton destroyed himself, not in combat, not at the hands of the enemy, but in 2 hospital tents where his volcanic temperament and his contempt for what he saw as weakness collided with soldiers suffering from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Patton slapped 2 soldiers, called them cowards. He famously yelled, "I won't have the cowardly sons of bitches stinking up this place." It was an explosion of the rage he kept barely controlled, the rage that fueled his aggressive command style, but also made him dangerous to the men under him. When the incidents became public, the reaction was swift and brutal. Patton, the hero of Sicily, became Patton the bully, the abuser, the unhinged commander who attacked his own traumatized soldiers. Eisenhower, under immense pressure, relieved him of command and buried him in England for months while the Führer died down. For Montgomery, Patton's implosion must have felt like cosmic justice. Here was proof that the American general's aggressive style was rooted not in strategic brilliance but in uncontrolled emotion, that his leadership was fundamentally flawed, that his contempt for caution was really just contempt for the lives of his men. Montgomery never said this publicly. He was too politically astute for that, but in private conversations, the implication was there. Patton had shown his true nature. The slapping incidents revealed what Montgomery had suspected all along, that beneath the bravado was a man who couldn't control himself, who was temperamentally unsuited for the responsibility of command. But here's the complication. Patton was also too valuable to discard permanently. Eisenhower knew it. Marshall knew it. For all his flaws, Patton was one of the few Allied commanders who could inspire terror in German forces. His name alone had operational value. The Germans feared him. They positioned forces expecting his arrival. He was, in that sense, irreplaceable. So Patton languished in England through the fall and winter of 1943, sidelined during the crucial planning for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion. He became part of an elaborate deception, assigned to command a phantom army group that existed only to fool German intelligence into thinking the invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. It was humiliating, and it gave Montgomery time to solidify his position as the ground forces commander for the invasion. While Patton stewed in exile, Montgomery planned the greatest amphibious operation in history. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Montgomery commanded all Allied ground forces during the initial invasion phase. It was the pinnacle of his career, the moment his careful planning and methodical approach would be vindicated on the largest possible stage. The invasion succeeded. Allied forces established a beachhead. But then came the battle for Keene. Montgomery promised to take Keene on day one. The city was a critical road junction, the hinge on which the entire Normandy campaign would turn. It was supposed to fall quickly, within hours or days of the landing. It took him 6 weeks. German forces, particularly SS Panzer divisions, defended with fanatical determination. British and Canadian casualties mounted. The city didn't fall. The advance stalled. And then Montgomery began to rewrite the narrative. He later claimed that the battle for Keene was always meant to be a holding action, designed to draw German armor onto the British sector while American forces broke out in the West. It was, he insisted, part of the plan all along, a deliberate strategy to fix the enemy in place. But that's not what he said before the battle. To Patton, when he finally arrived in Normandy, this wasn't just a delay, it was a lie. Montgomery had promised to take Keene on day one. He failed, and now he was claiming that failure was actually success, that the stalled offensive was strategic genius. For Patton, this was Montgomery at his worst, claiming credit when things went well, reframing failure as intentional strategy when they didn't. It was intellectual dishonesty dressed up as operational sophistication. And the frustration in American circles grew, because while Montgomery's forces ground slowly against German defenses, Patton's Third Army was finally unleashed in late July and early August. And Patton did what he always did. He attacked with speed and violence that stunned the enemy. His forces broke through at Avranches, poured into Brittany, then pivoted east in a massive envelopment that threatened to trap German forces in Normandy. It was aggressive, it was risky, and it worked. American armored columns raced across France. Towns fell daily. The map changed color at a pace that made Montgomery's careful advances look glacial. The press coverage was everything Patton had dreamed of. American newspapers ran banner headlines about Patton's dash across France. He was the liberator of Paris in the public imagination, even though French forces and other Allied units played crucial roles. The narrative that Patton cultivated was simple and seductive. While British forces moved cautiously, Americans moved fast and won decisively. Montgomery's response came in his communications with British leadership and in carefully phrased statements to the press. He emphasized that the breakout was only possible because British and Canadian forces had absorbed the German armored reserves around Keene, that Patton's success was built on the foundation of British sacrifice, that without the holding action in the east there would have been no opportunity in the west, all of which was, to a degree, true, but it sounded like excuse-making. It sounded like a commander who couldn't stand to see someone else get credit. And the American response was predictable. Maybe if Montgomery moved faster, more German forces could have been trapped. Maybe if British forces had taken Keene when they were supposed to, the breakout could have happened sooner with fewer casualties overall. The recriminations flew back and forth, filtered through official channels, but bitter nonetheless. And always, underneath every dispute about strategy and credit, was the personal animosity between two men who each believed they should be the hero of the story. September 1944. Montgomery convinced Eisenhower to approve Operation Market Garden, an audacious plan to drop Allied airborne forces deep behind German lines in the Netherlands, seize a series of bridges, and open a path for British armored forces to drive into Germany and end the war by Christmas. It was, ironically, the kind of aggressive, risky operation that Patton might have proposed. But it came from Montgomery, and it failed. The plan was too optimistic. It assumed German resistance would be light. It assumed the armored advance could move quickly enough to relieve the paratroopers before they were overwhelmed. It assumed, in short, the kind of things that Montgomery usually didn't assume. He had gambled, and the gamble failed. British airborne forces at Arnhem were cut off, surrounded, and destroyed. The armored column couldn't break through. Thousands of Allied soldiers were killed or captured. It was the kind of disaster that Montgomery had built his career avoiding. For Patton, Market Garden's failure was a vindication of everything he believed about Montgomery. When Montgomery tried to fight like Patton, he failed because he didn't understand aggressive warfare the way Patton did. He didn't have the instinct for it. His attempt at boldness was clumsy, poorly conceived, and it got men killed unnecessarily. Patton's private comments were scathing. Montgomery had wasted elite airborne forces on a plan that anyone with real aggressive instinct could have seen was doomed. He had squandered resources that could have been used to support American drives into Germany. And now, predictably, Montgomery was attempting to frame the operation as a partial success because it secured some of the bridges and established a salient into the Netherlands. But here's the complexity. Eisenhower shared some of the blame. He had approved the operation. He had allocated resources to it. And the strategic situation in September 1944 was genuinely challenging. Allied supply lines were stretched thin. Multiple commanders were competing for limited resources. The Germans, though retreating, were far from finished. Montgomery's argument after Market Garden was that if Eisenhower had given him all the resources he requested, concentrated Allied strength in the north for a single thrust into Germany, the operation would have succeeded and the war would have ended months earlier. The broad front strategy that Eisenhower favored, trying to push forward simultaneously across the entire Western Front, was wasteful and slow. Patton's counter-argument was equally forceful. If Eisenhower had given him the fuel and supplies, if Patton had been allowed to drive his Third Army across the Rhine in September before German defenses solidified, he could have reached Berlin before the Soviets. Montgomery's failure at Arnhem proved that the northern route was a dead end. Both men were arguing the same thing from opposite directions. Give me everything, and I'll win the war. Deny me resources, and we'll be stuck fighting through the winter. Eisenhower, caught between two massive egos and genuine strategic complexity, chose the middle path. He would push forward on a broad front, supporting both Montgomery and Patton and other commanders, trying to keep the Germans off balance everywhere. It was probably the right decision. But it satisfied no one, least of all the two generals who each believed they could have been the war winner if only they'd been given the chance. December 1944. The Germans launched a massive surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes, smashing into American positions and creating a dangerous bulge in the Allied lines. It was a crisis. American units were surrounded at Bastogne. The entire Allied advance had been thrown into chaos. Montgomery, commanding forces to the north of the breakthrough, was given temporary command of American units on the northern shoulder of the bulge. It was an operational necessity. Eisenhower needed someone to coordinate the response in that sector, and Montgomery was positioned to do it. For Patton, this was salt in an old wound. But he focused on what he did best. He turned the Third Army 90 degrees, attacked north into the German flank, and drove toward Bastogne with characteristic speed and aggression. It was one of the most impressive maneuvers of the war, shifting an entire army's axis of advance in winter conditions and striking the enemy while they were still off balance. The Third Army's relief of Bastogne became legendary. It was exactly the kind of dramatic, aggressive action that fed Patton's legend and the American public's appetite for heroes. Montgomery's forces, meanwhile, contained the northern shoulder of the Bulge and prepared for a methodical counterattack once German momentum had been exhausted. It was sound. It was careful. It was Montgomery. And then Montgomery held a press conference. January 7, 1945. Montgomery briefed journalists on the Battle of the Bulge. And in that briefing, he described the battle as an Allied disaster that he personally tidied up. He explicitly said he employed the whole available power of the British group of armies to save the American forces. He made it sound as though British forces under his command had rescued the Americans from catastrophe, that when American units faltered, Montgomery had stepped in and taken control and saved the situation. And in the way he phrased the timeline, he even stripped Patton of credit for the relief of Bastogne, making it sound as though Montgomery's northern operations were the decisive factor while American efforts were secondary. It was technically defensible. He had commanded northern sector forces. British units had fought well. But the tone, the implication, the suggestion that American forces needed British leadership to overcome German aggression, it ignited a firestorm. This specific detail enrages Americans even today. The idea that Montgomery took credit for American blood, that he diminished the courage and sacrifice of the soldiers at Bastogne and across the Ardennes while positioning himself as their savior. American commanders and the American press erupted. This was beyond the usual rivalry. This was Montgomery claiming credit for an American battle, diminishing American sacrifice, and positioning himself as the indispensable man who had to rescue incompetent Americans. Patton's reaction was everything you would expect. In his diary, in conversations with other commanders, he expressed a rage so intense that Eisenhower had to intervene to prevent it from becoming an international incident. Patton wanted to confront Montgomery directly. He wanted a public rebuttal. He wanted, in essence, to challenge Montgomery not just professionally but personally. Eisenhower had to manage the crisis carefully. He needed Montgomery for the final push into Germany. He needed Patton for the same reason. But the alliance was fracturing under the weight of accumulated resentment and ego. British leadership, sensing the danger, reined Montgomery in. Churchill himself had to smooth things over with American leadership. Montgomery issued a clarification that fell short of an apology, but walked back the worst implications of his press conference. But the damage was done. The relationship between Montgomery and Patton, never warm, was now irretrievably poisoned. They would finish the war on the same side, but they would never forgive each other. This press conference almost caused Eisenhower to fire Montgomery. That's how serious the breach had become. As Allied forces closed in on Germany in early 1945, both Montgomery and Patton believed they should have the honor of capturing Berlin. Montgomery argued that a concentrated thrust from the north, British forces driving on the German capital, was the most direct route to ending the war. His forces were positioned for it. They had the capability. Give him the resources, and he would deliver victory. Patton argued that the Third Army could reach Berlin from the south if given priority for fuel and supplies. His forces were already closer than Montgomery's in some sectors. He could move faster. He had proven it repeatedly. But the decision was never really in doubt. Political and strategic realities had already determined that Berlin would fall to Soviet forces. The Western Allies would stop at the Elbe River. Berlin was too far east, too costly to take, and too politically sensitive given agreements with Stalin. Neither Montgomery nor Patton got their wish, and for both men, it must have felt like the final denial of destiny. Patton took it harder. He had spent the entire war fighting for recognition, for glory, for the chance to prove that his aggressive philosophy could deliver decisive victory. And in the end, political considerations and Eisenhower's strategic caution denied him the ultimate prize. Montgomery, characteristically, framed it as a vindication of his arguments about concentration of force. If only Eisenhower had listened, if only resources had been concentrated for a northern thrust earlier, Berlin could have been in Allied hands before the Soviets arrived. Both narratives were self-serving. Both ignored military and political realities that made their proposals problematic. But both men took the denial personally, as though Eisenhower's decision was a judgment on their worth as commanders, rather than a response to complex strategic imperatives. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Montgomery and Patton had both played crucial roles in Allied victory. They had both demonstrated exceptional skill and leadership. They should have been able to look back on shared triumph. Instead, they spent the post-war period fighting over credit. Montgomery published his memoirs and made it clear that he considered himself the architect of Allied victory in Europe. His careful planning, his methodical approach, his ability to manage complex operations, those were the foundation on which victory was built. Other commanders, he implied, had contributed. But the vision, the strategy, that was Montgomery. Even in his memoirs, decades later, Montgomery refused to admit that Patton was his equal. The condescension that had poisoned their relationship during the war continued long after the guns fell silent. Patton never got the chance to write his full response. He died in a car accident in December 1945, months after the war ended. But in his diaries, he went to his grave believing that Montgomery had cost the Allies months of war. That Montgomery's caution had prolonged the conflict unnecessarily. That if Patton had been given the resources and freedom to operate, the war would have ended sooner. His supporters, his biographers, his admirers, they fought that battle for him. They published his papers, his diaries, his letters. They made the case that Patton was the aggressive genius who could have won the war faster if cautious commanders like Montgomery hadn't held him back. The debate became part of World War the second historiography. Books, documentaries, academic studies, all grappling with the question, who was right? Who deserves more credit? Whose philosophy of war was superior? But that's not really the question this story is about, because the truth is, they were both right, and they were both wrong. Montgomery's caution saved lives. It also sometimes missed opportunities. Patton's aggression won battles. It also sometimes cost lives unnecessarily. War is too complex, too contingent, too dependent on circumstances for there to be one correct approach. The tragedy is that two brilliant commanders spent so much energy fighting each other that they undermined the very cooperation that could have made both of them more effective. So what did the war of egos cost? Operationally, it's hard to measure. Did Montgomery's resentment of Patton's slow British support for American operations? Did Patton's contempt for Montgomery make him less willing to coordinate when coordination was needed? Maybe. Probably. But war is messy, and cause and effect are often impossible to untangle. Strategically, the cost was clearer. Eisenhower spent enormous amounts of time and political capital managing the rivalry between his subordinate commanders. Time that could have been spent on operational planning instead went to soothing egos, mediating disputes, and preventing public feuds that would damage Allied unity. Politically, the Montgomery-Patton rivalry fed into broader tensions between British and American forces. It reinforced stereotypes, encouraged nationalist narratives, and made the alliance more fragile than it needed to be at critical moments. But perhaps the deepest cost was to the men themselves. Montgomery built a reputation for brilliance, but his need to claim credit and his inability to share glory made him a difficult subordinate and a problematic ally. His post-war memoirs were widely criticized for their self-aggrandizement. His relationships with American commanders never recovered. He ended his career respected but not beloved, admired but not trusted. Patton died before he could fully reckon with his legacy. But even in death, his reputation was complicated by the slapping incidents, by questions about whether his aggressive style was worth the casualties it sometimes caused, by the sense that for all his tactical brilliance, he lacked the political sophistication and self-control needed for the highest levels of command. Both men were haunted by what they might have achieved if given free rein. Montgomery believed until his death that he could have ended the war in 1944 if Eisenhower had supported his northern thrust into Germany. Patton believed the same about his own drives to the east. Neither could accept that the war was bigger than their individual ambitions, that victory required cooperation and compromise, not just brilliance and aggression. We return to that moment in North Africa, to Montgomery's attitude toward the Americans, to his memo calling them complete amateurs, to his off-the-record comments that painted Patton as reckless and theatrical, to words that seemed minor at the time but carried poison that spread through the entire Allied command structure. What if Montgomery had been more generous? What if he had praised American aggressiveness while offering to support it with British logistics and planning? What if he had framed Allied operations as a genuine partnership rather than a hierarchy with himself at the top? What if Patton had been more secure? What if he hadn't needed the headlines, hadn't craved recognition so desperately that every slight felt like a mortal wound? What if he had been content to let his battlefield achievements speak for themselves? These are unanswerable questions, because men are who they are. Montgomery was never going to be humble. Patton was never going to be content with supporting roles. Their personalities were fixed long before they met on North African battlefields, but it's worth considering what was lost in their rivalry. Not just operational efficiency or strategic coordination, but something more fundamental. The chance for two genuinely great commanders to learn from each other, to combine Montgomery's careful planning with Patton's aggressive execution, to create something greater than either could achieve alone. Instead, they spent their energy diminishing each other, and in doing so, they diminished themselves. The war of egos that started with cutting remarks and private memos outlasted the war itself. It shaped how both men are remembered. It influenced how historians assess their contributions. It became part of their legacy, inseparable from their achievements. Montgomery said things about Patton that started a war. He called the Americans complete amateurs. He implied Patton was reckless, a Wild West general more concerned with glory than sound strategy. He said it privately to commanders who mattered. He said it in ways that leaked to the press. He said it publicly at the Bulge press conference in a way that almost destroyed the alliance. But Patton said things about Montgomery too. They both spoke words that couldn't be unsaid, that hardened positions, that turned professional disagreement into personal hatred. In the end, what did Montgomery say about Patton? He said that Patton was reckless, theatrical, more concerned with glory than sound strategy, an amateur playing at war. He said it often enough and publicly enough that it couldn't be ignored, privately enough that it felt like betrayal. What did those words cost? They cost trust. They cost cooperation. They cost both men the peace of mind that comes from shared purpose and mutual respect. The Second World War was won by Allied forces in spite of, not because of, the rivalry between its most aggressive and most cautious commanders. It was won by the soldiers who fought under both men, who didn't care about credit or glory, who just wanted to go home. But the war of egos, that war never ended. It echoes still in every biography, every documentary, every argument about who was right and who was wrong. And perhaps that's the real lesson. That pride in wartime is a luxury no one can afford. That leadership requires not just brilliance but humility. That word spoken in anger or arrogance can start wars that outlast any armistice. Montgomery and Patton both wanted to be remembered as the greatest commander of World War II. Instead, they're remembered as two brilliant men who couldn't stop fighting each other long enough to fully appreciate what they could have accomplished together. History doesn't have heroes and villains. It has complicated, flawed human beings trying to navigate impossible pressures. Montgomery and Patton were both heroes in their way. They were both deeply flawed in their way. They were both victims of their own egos. And somewhere in North Africa, in private memos and off-the-record comments, in words that seemed so small at the time, the seeds of that tragedy were planted, not by malice, not by evil, just by pride, just by the very human need to be recognized, to be first, to be remembered. The war they fought against each other hurt them both, but it started with words, with what Montgomery said about Patton, with calling the Americans complete amateurs, with implying that Patton was a reckless showboat, with the Bulge press conference that almost shattered the alliance, with what those words meant and what they cost and how they echoed through a war and beyond. That's the story, not of tactics or strategy, but of ego, of pride, of two men who could have been allies and chose or perhaps couldn't help but become rivals instead. The war ended. The rivalry didn't. And the words that started it still echo.